Hello, everybody. Welcome back. World History AP with Mr. Ancharsky. This is the updated version of Chapter 2, actually, of the Revolutions unit. I think I am going to change this chapter and the next chapter's videos. I'm pretty confident in my Industrial Revolution videos, so I'm going to keep those the same, although I am going to change the one about what does life look like in the Americas after independence. I will definitely change that one since it is a little confusing. All right. So they'll work on the screen for you. Identify one cause and one effect of the American Revolution. So identify one cause. So that's like one sentence, and then identify one effect of the American Revolution. So if you say identify one cause, kind of say why it caused it, I guess. All right. So chapter 2, we are going to deal with the French Revolution, our second Enlightenment-inspired revolution. That's going to be a very important revolution in European history, but as we're also going to see by the end of today, hopefully, in world history as well. So we're going to continue with this lesson objective of seeing how the Enlightenment impacts societies over time, but we're also going to be able to explain how and why revolutions happened and the effects of these revolutions. So let's look at the French Revolution today. And just to kind of sum it up in all of its complexity, the French Revolution is going to be a lot more radical than the American Revolution, at least in its goals. And we're going to see why I'm saying that statement right now. But there are going to be profound changes and very radical ways those changes are designed to be implemented. So let's take a look at the kind of context of France by the start of this age of revolutions. So in France, we do see a very rigid class hierarchy, and we call the different classes of France the estates. And there are 3 estates in France. The first 2 estates are the nobility and the clergy. So the nobility, those are nobles, obviously. The clergy, members of the Catholic Church, priests, bishops, etc. But these first 2 estates have a lot of special privileges that the third estate does not have. The first 2 estates, for one thing, don't have to pay taxes. They can charge their own special taxes, actually, and we call those special taxes tithes, actually, Tithes. So the nobility and clergy make up a very small percent of France's population, about 2%, both of them combined. And yet, despite the fact that they have 2% of the population, they control government, they control the religious structure of France. There's no religious freedom. We'll see how that changes. But below this first and second estate is everybody else. And by everybody else, I mean everybody else. That includes people like merchants and bankers, but it also includes poor people. It includes property-less people. It includes peasants. It includes urban workers as well. And yet, despite making up almost 98% of France's population, they have no political representation. They have no political representation, but guess what? They're the ones responsible for paying all of France's taxes. So they're being taxed without representation. Some people are wanting to change that because guess what? The Americans changed that with their revolution. So we start to see kind of that this unequal class distribution is a major cause of the French Revolution. The fact that there's no representation and there's taxation is a major cause of the French Revolution. And we can kind of see the state of the third estate in this cartoon right here. This cartoon has Louis XVI right here. He's a fat guy with the whip right here. And him and a member of the clergy, so a member of the Catholic Church, and then a noble, they're riding on top of, you guessed it, a member of the third estate. Louis XVI, the King of France at the time, he's digging his heels, his spurs, into the member of the third estate right there. So this political cartoon represents the very rigid class hierarchy that will motivate the French Revolution. It's obviously kind of hyperbole. But let's see kind of what else is present in France prior to the French Revolution. Well, the French Revolution is going to be, again, characterized by an attempt to reorganize France socially. Because in comparison to the American Revolution, French society was a lot more hierarchical than American colonial society was when it comes to property ownership. We saw that in American colonies, there was already representative governments. There was no such thing at all in France. And that's because, as you remember from Unit 3, France had absolutism. And remember, absolutism, the political theory that power should be in the hands of an absolute monarch, a monarch who has control over political, economic, and social institutions. And we saw that with guys like Sexy Legs over here, Louis XIV. And under Louis XIV, we saw that power was unevenly distributed in France. That all power was in the hands of the monarchy and the nobility and the clergy. But even bodies designed to have representation, like the Estates General, were basically just ignored. And what was the Estates General? Well, as you might remember, the Estates General was a government body. Essentially, it's kind of like a parliament made up of different estates, made up of the different classes. They all meet together, and the purpose of the Estates General is to approve new taxes passed by the French king. However, ever since Louis XIV, ever since 1614, actually that's well before Louis XIV, the Estates General has not met. So taxes have pretty much stayed the same, and the Third Estate has had to pay all of them. However, it's not really a problem in France until 1789. And why is it a problem? Well, by 1789, as you might remember from yesterday, as you might remember, I should say, from last presentation, countries of Europe are becoming bankrupt. They're becoming bankrupt because of very expensive wars. Wars like the 7 Years' War, but also in terms of France, helping out the Americans in the American Independence War. So we are going to see that France essentially is going to become bankrupt. And it's going to need to raise taxes by 1789. But how do you raise taxes? You need to meet with the Estates General, which hasn't met for 175 years. And in that 175 years, a lot of things have happened intellectually, especially things like the Enlightenment. The American Revolution happened. That idea that political power only comes through political representation. So keep all of these things in the back of your mind when we're thinking about causes of the French Revolution. Well, we're going to deal with actually a new French monarch now. This is the great-grandson of Louis XIV, and he ruled so long, literally his great-grandson was his eventual successor. So what are some causes of the French Revolution? Well, I hope you're able to guess the very first thing that's going to be on here, and that is the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is the major cause of all of these liberal revolutions during the Age of Revolution. The idea that government has a responsibility to protect private property, that it cannot take it away without the consent of the governed. You cannot tax us without having our representation, without having our voice heard in government. So the Enlightenment will be the intellectual justification for the French Revolution. But on top of this, there's a deeper class intense struggle in France. And that's especially apparent in how hated the monarchy and the nobility, the wealthy, politically important people of France, are. there's a famine that's going on in 1789, actually. There's a lot of bad weather. It's causing famine. There's not enough food to go around. That raises prices for bread. People are very poor in large parts of France. Peasants, urban workers, even middle-class people are starting to feel a hurt, although don't feel too much sympathy for them. Well, I mean, feel whatever you want, I guess. But there is intense economic problems that seemingly the government of France is unable to solve. And that is going to intensify hostility to the monarchy because the monarchy is not making any cutbacks. Look at Louis XVI right here. Not to fat shame him, but he looks well fed. He's not starving. He's wearing a literal fur coat during a time of economic poverty. So there is going to be kind of this anti-monarchy sentiment, anti-nobility sentiment, because the current government of France is unable to solve economic problems. However, what is the thing that sparks off the French Revolution? Well, it's going to be the meeting together of all the estates in the Estates General of 1789. Louis XVI, the King of France, he's a very ineffective ruler. He wants to be a watchmaker. Like literally, he is so pissed that he had to become king, that he couldn't do what he wanted, build watches. But Louis XVI is going to realize France is out of money, and we cannot continue without any money. We need to raise taxes. Why is France out of money? France helped out the American Revolution, literally to get back at the British for their defeat in the 7 Years' War. But we see that there will be this desire to raise money. How do you raise money? You need new taxes. How do you get new taxes? You need to get the Estates General together. So the meeting of the Estates General is going to lead to all of these grievances by the Third Estate being voiced in the Estates General. So the Third Estate comes thinking they're going to make their demands heard. And their demands are a better system of representation, fairer taxation, and restrictions on the king's political powers. However, the Third Estate is saying some pretty radical things. I mean, give up my power? I'm Louis XVI in this case. Give up Louis XVI's power? Well, I don't like that. The clergy and the nobility, they're also saying, what, we have to pay taxes? What the heck? No, your ideas are too radical, Third Estate. We're literally going to lock you out of the Estates General. And in response to that, actually, members of the Third Estate are going to say, fine, you don't want us here, we will make our own government. And that government becomes something called the National Assembly. The National Assembly has this idea that there's a fairer system of representation, that members of the Third Estate have a proportional voice in government, and that all of the estates are taxed fairly. So the National Assembly is going to claim that they are going to be the new government of France. They make an offer to Louis XVI. Hey, if you recognize us as the real power of France, we will keep you around as king. You will be a constitutional monarch. However, to back up this offer, the Third Estate is going to get weapons. And where do they get these weapons from? They get them from a prison called the Bastille. The Bastille was this big old prison. It only had like 7 people. Most of them were like mentally ill, so not really a political threat. But there was this really big prison that had a bunch of weapons. And members of the Third Estate will organize angry, poor workers to storm this prison, steal the guns, and basically threaten the monarchy to become a constitutional monarchy. And this is what begins the first phase of the French Revolution, the Moderate Revolution. And the French Moderate Revolution is more so, it's not the whole guillotine chopping off heads sort of thing you might be familiar with. It's more so, how can we keep the king around, but make some changes that are a bit more fair? for us, members of the Third Estate. So the moderate French Revolution is going to introduce a constitutional monarchy, a system of government where a king has their powers controlled by a constitution. And this constitution is going to come from a list of rights that the members of the Third Estate will draft called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. And this is a perfect example of how the Enlightenment is inspiring political change, because those ideas of natural rights, of representation, of the consent of the governed are all going to be expressed in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. And what exactly is this declaration saying? Well, it's influenced by the ideas of the Enlightenment, for one thing. It's influenced by the American Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson literally helps write it. He's at least in the same room when it's being written. He's the ambassador to France at the time. But what is the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen doing? Well, it's going to do a few things. It's going to set up the new political system of France. It's going to be a list of special rights granted to all men in France. It's a statement that government has the responsibility to protect natural rights like liberty, property, and security. But it's also going to introduce very radical changes, at least in the history of France. For one thing, it is going to legally end serfdom. Serfdom had already kind of been on the decline since the Black Death, as we all know, but it's starting to fade away legally because of the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. That's a mouthful to say. So the ending of serfdom, the ending of special feudal privileges. Nobles and clergymen are no longer exempt, no longer are free of paying taxes. They have to pay taxes now. So it's going to end special political privileges for the nobility and the clergy. It's going to reduce the Catholic Church's influence on government. So the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen are embodying those ideas of natural rights, life, liberty, property, security. It's introducing the idea of the consent of the governed, that there are no special privileges granted to members of the nobility or the clergy. And it's also secularizing the French government. Wowee, whoop-de-doo, that's amazing. However, this moderate French Revolution is going to face some problems. And it's because of these problems the French Revolution is going to be pushed to become more extreme, more radical. And what are these problems exactly? Well, for one thing, even though the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen could grant all of these wonderful special privileges and rights to every French man, that's still not solving underlying class conflict. That's still not solving the issues revolving around peasants. Peasants are still hungry. There's still a famine going on, and the new government is doing nothing about that. It's intensifying hostility to the monarchy and the nobility that are still around. So there is going to be this inability to solve the problems facing poor people. But on top of that, there's also this anxiety in France that the revolution's gains could be pulled back. Because there is this fear that Louis XVI might ask the other absolute monarchs of Europe to help him seize back absolute control. So there is this fear that the other countries of Europe, places like Spain and Austria and Russia and England, could invade and take away all of these gains. A fear that seemingly will come true, as we'll see in a second. However, there's also a problem in terms of the big picture. that these natural rights are mostly going to be limited again to property owning white men. Because women are excluded from all of these discussions. At this point, slavery has not been touched. And we do actually see that kind of the failings of this moderate French Revolution will inspire movements for reform, movements for change. And we do actually see the birth of what we call first wave feminism. First wave feminism is a political and philosophical idea that women should be given the same natural rights, the same political freedoms as men. The idea that women should be able to vote, that women should have suffrage, women should have protections for their private property, women should be able to divorce. And a good example of an advocate for very early feminism, like very early feminism, is this lady right here, Olympe de Gouges. Olympe de Gouges will write her own kind of counter proposal to the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. It's the Declaration of the Rights of Woman and the Female Citizen. So the idea that natural rights should be extended to women, that's something that is going on in all of this conflict. So let's see how the French Revolution will become more radical. How is it going to change to become very anti-monarchy? Well, it's mostly because Louis XVI is not going to help out his reputation. In 1791, Louis XVI, not liking giving up all his power and fearing that more radical changes could come, is going to actually try and leave France. He's thinking, oh, maybe I'll go to Austria. Maybe I'll hook up with my buddies in Austria there, the absolute monarchs over there. Those absolute monarchs. Anyway, the absolute monarchs over there in Austria, and maybe they'll help me regain my power. So Louis XVI is going to flee with his family, or at least attempt to. He's stopped by the border guard, actually, who's literally like, dude, your face is on our coins. Aren't you the king or something? You can't leave. You have to go back to Paris. You have to go back to the palace in Paris. And Louis XVI actually eventually is going to be charged with treason, with conspiring against France with France's enemies, like Austria, like Spain, like other countries of Europe, like Russia as well. And eventually, Louis XVI is going to be charged with treason, which is, in many countries, something that could be punished by death. And it is punished by death in Louis XVI's case. In 1792, Louis XVI is going to have his head chopped off, guillotined. The guillotine is a new special device, a new innovation that is going to chop people's heads off a lot quicker, more humanely, in theory anyway. However, Louis getting killed, Louis getting his head chopped off, that's a game changer. That's a game changer in a world that believes the right for kings to rule comes from God. You killed God's representative on earth. What the heck? You can do anything if you can kill the guy God put on earth to rule over people. So this is going to usher us into a more radical phase of the French Revolution. We are going to see that groups of people that are hostile to the monarchy, groups like the Jacobins, which is a political party essentially made up of anti-monarch people, pro-republic people, led by this weird-looking dude, Robespierre, Maximilien Robespierre. Robespierre eventually is kind of going to seize power in this republic. He is going to keep the republic around, but he is the leader of France, kind of its quasi-president, you could say. And Robespierre and the Jacobins are going to try and secure the revolution by eliminating all traces of the Ancien regime, all traces of the old order. So we are going to see profound radical changes happen during Robespierre's reign as a leader of France. And we see actually that France is going to become, for the first time in its history, but certainly not the last time in its history, a republic, the first French republic. We have no more king. We executed him. 1792, absolutism in France is finally over. The king is dead. Long live the Republic. And this Republic is going to try and get rid of all traces of what came before the Revolution. So in this way, the American Revolution is less radical than the French Revolution. The French Revolution tried to reshape French society to make it unrecognizable. So what are some examples of this? Well, for one thing, we are going to see the granting of universal male suffrage. Every man, regardless of property ownership, can vote. That's what suffrage, universal male suffrage means. Every man can vote. That is a huge radical change in French history and in world history, actually, because in the American Revolution, only property-owning men could vote. And still, it's only men. It's still not enslaved people. But every man, regardless of property ownership, can vote. But on top of this, the French Revolution under Robespierre is going to get rid of slavery, actually. We'll kind of see the inspiration for that when we talk about the Haitian Revolution in just a second, but slavery is going to be abolished. But on top of this, we also see radical changes for women as well. Women are granted the right to divorce. Women can own property. Women aren't granted the right to vote. That's too radical. But still, there are a lot of changes even for women and enslaved people. But we also see this radical attempt to get rid of the old order, the Ancien Régime, by secularizing France. So we are going to see a rise in what we call anti-clericalism, anti-church sentiment. And we see that in how the French government will become almost completely secularized. So we are going to actually see the getting rid of the ability of the church to pick its own priests, for one thing. We see priests and clergymen completely excluded, separated from government. We see the creation of a new calendar. That's how radical the French Revolution is. The Gregorian calendar is too Christian. We have a new calendar based on Republican values, small r, Republican values. We have our own cult of reason, literally a quasi-religious belief system that is worshiping science, for God's sake, for lack of God's sake in this case. Haha. The French Revolution is very radical. They try and get rid of literally any traces they can. They introduce the metric system because the old system of measurement is based on monarchy. They try and get rid of the statues in Notre Dame, the cathedral in Paris, because they think they represent French monarchs, when actually they represent the 12 tribes of Israel. They cut off their heads. They cut off the heads of statues. That's how anti-monarchy, anti-religious the French Revolution became. However, we also see that this radical French Revolution can be characterized by violence as well, something that is different, you could say, from the American Revolution. Obviously, the American Revolution, there was a war for independence. But compared to the French Revolution, a lot of the political changes made were mostly bloodless. Because during the radical French Revolution, suspected anti-revolutionary people, counter-revolutionaries, are going to be executed. Former monarch, or well, obviously the former monarch, Louis XVI, his head got cut off, but nobles, members of the church, anybody who seemingly supports those things, anyone accused of committing treason. We do see a period of hostility to counter-revolutionaries called the Reign of Terror. People will be executed, political enemies executed, anyone suspected of being against the revolution. And Robespierre. Eventually, Robespierre himself is executed. There's basically a power struggle that takes place in the French Republic. Then this thing called the Directory comes about. You wouldn't need to know that. But we do see that all of these political changes are secured by upending the social fabric of France and by executing basically everybody. Well, not everybody, obviously, but a lot of people, thousands of people. However, how are the other countries of Europe going to respond to all of this radical bloodshed? Well, literally every country in Europe is going to declare war on France as a result of getting rid of Louis XVI. So countries like Austria, Spain, places like England and Russia, all of these countries declare war on France in an attempt to restore the French monarchy, bring it back. Because Louis XVI, his wife was killed, he was killed, his children locked up, some of them died of tuberculosis in prison. They could put in a new cousin. So there is an attempt by the other countries of Europe to invade France and put in a new monarchy. But the effect of this is going to be the rise of nationalism. Because one of the major results of the French Revolution is the rise of nationalism. And again, remember, nationalism is the idea that a nation should be made up of people with a shared cultural, historic, and political identity. That our country is united because we have similar language, we have similar customs, we have a shared history. And nothing brings out nationalism more anywhere in any time period than wars. Because it creates this mentality that it's us versus them, that we have our identity that our enemies are trying to take away. So the birth of French nationalism is a very big deal, because this nationalism is going to be something that will spread to other countries, to countries like, quote unquote, Germany. And I say, quote unquote, Germany, because Germany isn't a united country. But the idea that we should be a united country because we have a shared language, a shared history, a shared culture, that's going to lead to the rise of new states, as we'll see by the end of this chapter. Another thing bringing out nationalism is the fact that every man has a say in some way in government. Every man can vote for representatives. So the idea of universal male suffrage makes it so people have some interest in keeping France together, keeping France a stable nation. And some examples of French nationalism include its national anthem, still the national anthem today, called the La Marseillaise. And obviously I can't speak French, so I'm very terrible with pronunciation. But the anthem is very, very good example of nationalism. In the first verse, it talks about the idea that France is being invaded by tyrants, by dictators, by the absolute monarchs seeking to overthrow the republic. And the chorus basically says, "To arms, citizens! Let us form our battalions to fight against the tyrannies of Europe. We will water the we will water the fields of France with the blood of our enemies." Because that's a major other aspect of nationalism. The idea that we have a superior culture, that we're fighting against enemies. And we see kind of this idea of political culture expressed in the motto of the French Revolution. Our identity is based on liberty, liberté, equality, égalité, fraternité, fraternity or brotherhood. For reasons that are beyond the scope of our class, the Republic eventually will end. It's too unstable. And this instability is going to see the rise of a new dictator, a dictator by the name of Napoleon. And you can listen to the Marseillaise on your own time. Napoleon is a military general who is going to see all of this instability within France, all of this constant execution, the reign of terror. And he's going to, in this atmosphere of instability, seize power for himself. So we are going to see that Napoleon will see all of this instability and decide, I should be in charge. And that's what he's going to do. He is going to take over the French Republic and make it into an empire. And he's going to declare himself emperor. So if we're thinking about that definition of a revolution being a cycle, France started with a monarchy and ended with an empire, an emperor. That's basically a monarch. However, Napoleon is different because he's going to be willing to consent to a constitutional monarchy. And he is going to make a monarchy that is somewhat controlled by a constitution influenced by the Enlightenment, as we'll see in a second. The other big thing about Napoleon you would need to understand is that Napoleon is going to realize the best way to save France from all of its invaders is to invade the rest of Europe. And that's what he's going to do. He's going to invade much of Europe. But what is the impact of Napoleon? Well, Napoleon is important in world and European history for a variety of reasons. For one thing, in conquering all of Europe, basically, Napoleon is going to put Europe under an Enlightenment-inspired constitution known as the Napoleonic Code, a legal system that embodies a lot of the trends of the Enlightenment. While he is going to take away rights for women, he's going to take away the right to divorce. While he's going to literally bring back slavery, we'll see how that leads to problems in a second, or in our next presentation. He is going to guarantee protections for property, religious freedom. He's going to liberate the Jews of Europe, actually. Because remember, Jews were excluded from many European societies, but he's granting religious freedom. That's a pretty cool thing. So all of these ideas of Enlightenment-inspired government being spread to the rest of Europe, that's a big deal. Napoleon's invasions are also going to spread the ideas of the Enlightenment, but it's also going to encourage nationalism as well. And why does it encourage nationalism? Well, it goes back to the idea that we, as a people, should rule our own nation. Not some stinky French guy. We, as Germans, for example, have a shared German identity, a shared culture, a shared history, a shared political belief, a shared economic system. A lot of the German states had similar economic systems. Well, kind of to resist invasion by the French, we see the creation of nationalism. How do we rally people against invaders? We form something to fight, something to die for. So the French Revolution is going to have all of these results right here. The French Revolution, I guess I should end Napoleon real quick. Napoleon's eventually going to be defeated at the Battle of Waterloo. And then to put kind of salt in all of this ironic wounds right here, guess who comes back into power? It's the Bourbon family. All of the countries of Europe defeat Napoleon. They remove him from power, kick him to a small island in the Atlantic Ocean, and then they bring back Louis XVI's cousin. So France did a full 360. It started with a Bourbon monarchy, and now it has a Bourbon monarchy again. But why is the French Revolution so important? Well, for one thing, even though monarchies will return to Europe, absolutism is not. Constitutional monarchs will. It's going to open the doors also for groups of people demanding more changes. We're going to see that there will be revolutions even against these constitutional monarchs. The French Revolution opened the doors to have a Republican-style government, the possibility to have that. The French Revolution will lead to the decline of the aristocracy all over Europe, not just in France. We also see that the French Revolution is important because it will inspire so many other revolutions that will be talked about in our second part of this chapter. There will be new ideologies that emerge, things like radicalism. Radicalism is the idea we should have complete democracy, so 100% male suffrage. Liberalism, the idea we should have either a republic or a constitutional monarchy is okay, as long as that government protects private property. And who should be able to vote? Well, it should be private property owners. There's also conservatism, the idea that all of those other ideas are way too much. We should keep things the same, keep absolute monarchies. But the biggest impact of all of the French Revolution is the spread of the Enlightenment, the spread of Enlightenment ideas of nationalism, not just in Europe, as we'll see later on in our next presentation, but in Latin America as well. And we'll see that in our third chapter, actually. So you should be able to identify all of these results, and you should also be able to compare the American and French Revolution. Thank you so much. We will talk about the spread of the French Revolution in our next presentation. Have a grand day.